Okay, so thank you very much. Can you hear me? If everything is
Yes,
working
very well.
fine. Perfect. Okay, great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I will now switch to the PowerPoint slides. I hope you can see that. Okay, great. So my name is Thomas Nägele, and I'm going to talk about the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act, also called TVTG. And what I will actually focus on is why this is the first comprehensive legal framework for the token economy. So let's start with the Liechtenstein regulation approach. What we did actually in 2016 is the Liechtenstein government started with a work group thinking about regulation. And what they did is we thought of like, do we need regulation? And because back then, I think if we remember back then, yes, we had some ICOs, but it was not like a lot. Even in Liechtenstein, there were not a lot of ICOs. But that was actually one of the goals, to think about regulation, to regulate the fundraising part. But quite soon, actually, the idea came up to have a legal framework for the token economy. And what is the legal framework for the token economy we are referring to? If you think of the token economy as just a way of how you actually digitize all the assets you have in an economy. So we all know that we already have quite a set of assets which we can trade on our markets, on capital markets. But there are many more assets which are not tradable. So we ended up with the idea of let's think about a regulation where you can actually trade a lot of assets and most of your assets in a digital way. And the concept basically is that you can use a technology, and we call it trusted technology. So we don't speak about blockchain or DLT. We refer to trusted technologies. So it's a very technological, neutral, agnostic approach because whatever development might come up or around the corner is, as long as it is serving the same purpose of having actually a technology which allows you trustless to transact between parties, it's covered by the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act. So we said, okay, we don't need the term blockchain nor DLT within the act itself. And another question was, should we use a classification approach? That's actually one which is globally quite known to differentiate between securities, utilities, and currencies. The concept of the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act is that this really doesn't matter a lot from a legal point of view, because the concept is that whatever you let a token represent, it doesn't change the nature of the asset or the right. So whenever you have something which is tokenized, you have to look at the asset itself and what regulation is applicable for that asset. So we said, okay, we don't need a classification here. And then we said, okay, if we have this trusted technology, what enables this trusted technology? It's transactions without intermediaries. So the trust comes from the technology, the technical design, how this system works. And this allowed actually to define a token very simple. A token is just a piece of information on a trusted technology system. So for example, a blockchain. So this TT within the token definition stands for trusted technology. And that was actually one of the first, I don't know if it's really the first globally, but for sure one of the first token definitions we have, that the token is a piece of information on a TT system which can represent rights. And that's very, very flexible. So whatever right you have, you can actually let the token represent that right. And think of that. I mean, in the end, if something is, let's say, your shareholder rights, your voting rights, your ownership rights, that doesn't matter as long as you let a token represent these rights. And in the end, because if you analyze what tokens really do, or what are the main functions of tokens, this sounds quite similar to the securities world, where we have securities which serve the same purpose. So we said, okay, what we will do is we will define something which we refer to as the token container model. We say, okay, you define a token technically with functions, what the token can actually do. And then let a token represent, for example, the ownership right of a physical thing, like a diamond. And then you put that right into the token. And the interesting thing here is that if you have that right represented by a token, you can use a blockchain system to easily transfer it from party to party. You can actually build up services. You can actually add a lot of functionality there. You can have programmed the token, and you from a technical point of view, you are very flexible, and from a legal point of view, you are also very flexible, because you can use whatever right you have within your existing legal system. And we thought about regulation in a way where we said, okay, if we don't need an intermediary, that the token economy is actually working properly, we will not have any intermediaries anymore. But there might be the need for new intermediaries. And the physical validator, I will come to that in a minute, that's one of these newly invented intermediaries, which is kind of interesting in an area where a technology actually started to get rid of the intermediaries. But if you think of the token economy, not only as Bitcoin started as a transaction system, you need intermediaries again. So with that model, you're very flexible. You can actually tokenize whatever right you have in your existing legal framework. I will not touch into much detail about the relationship model, but from a legal point of view, you need a link between what is happening on a trusted technology system like a blockchain and the individual, like the person or company who is actually doing or providing services or using that systems. And that's also actually defined in a very agnostic way. And what you will get out of this is actually enforceability. Because if you want to have a token economy, you have to think of who will use such a system if you don't have enforceability in the real world. If you think about like assets which are tokenized on a global scale, you need enforceability as well. So we said, okay, if you fulfill the requirements of the Blockchain Act, you will get this enforceability. And one requirement is that you not just only know the private key, so you don't only have the power of disposal, because that's similar to a possessor, but you have to have the right of disposal, similar to an ownership, for example, and we differentiate between these two. And if you dispose over a token and fulfill the three requirements, transfer in line with the regulation of the TT system, which is very simple. You have to be able to transact. You have to be able to use the technology properly, so you end up with a transaction. Second is consent of the parties. If parties agree, but that's very simple. I mean, in legal terms, you always have to have the consent of the parties to have a legally binding contract. And the third part is that the party has to have the power of disposal of the transferee. And if you fulfill these three requirements, this will result in the disposal over the token. That's one thing. But on the other hand, it also results in the disposal over the right represented by the token. And from a legal point of view, that's actually huge, because now you have an ecosystem, a token economy, where you can transfer token and rights represented by tokens very easily, following these three requirements, and you end up that the represented right under circumstances is also transferred. In the real world, yes, you have a lot of challenges, and not every right is easily transferred like that. but that's the general concept. If it is not working without any additional steps, then you have the coordination requirement. So if the write is not following the token without anything or without any additional step, then Article 7 is actually the coordination requirement, where which actually states, as I said, if it's not coming to force by law, the person obliged must ensure through suitable measures that we end up with the same result. So if you transfer the token, that the right has also been transferred. You can do that, and that's a very flexible actually approach, because it differs if you want to, for example, transfer the ownership of a physical object to, let's say, the ownership of IP rights. I mean, there's no ownership with IP rights, but so it's really, you have to have a look at every specific right you want to tokenize. And if it's not possible by law, then you have to have the suitable measures. So this ends up, with that you end up again with a very flexible solution, and you can actually tokenize as many rights as somehow possible. And why is that possible? And what was actually the main thought behind the Blockchain Act and how it was actually tailored is that we know, all of us, we know that trust in intermediaries, you can actually build trust or minimize the risks involved in transactions with regulation of intermediaries. We all know that, for example, if you have the capital market or if you have the banking system, you trust, or you trust your bank because you know that they have to be fit and proper. They, not only the shareholders but the management, they have to have internal control systems. They're audited on an ongoing base, and therefore you trust your bank, for example. With blockchain, it's different. With blockchain, the trust is actually coming from a technology which is trustless. So you don't, I mean, that's the, from a technological point of view, it's trustless technologies. But the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act speaks about trusted technologies, but it is actually referring to the same. So the trust is not coming from regulation of intermediaries. The trust is actually deriving from having a technology where you don't need to trust the other party. The technology itself works in a way that no trust is needed. And as I said, we ended up with having new regulated intermediaries. And why is that the case? First of all, I mean, yes, we have a lot of very interested persons which actually use blockchain technologies, and they're willing to store their own private keys and do everything themselves. But for sure, the majority of people, they don't want to think about how to store their private keys. So you need professional services, at least in the transition period, I mean. And you need something to bridge the digital world with the real world. Because in the end, you, even if you transfer, as I said, the ownership right of the physical thing, in the digital world, you have to assure that in the real world, this asset is transferred or actually put in custody on your behalf. And yes, one of the concepts is abuse prevention, where you have intermediaries, because it's more easy to address these issues, but you can do that in a technological way as well. So as I said, if you don't want to manage, for example, your own private keys, you can ask a professional service provider, and actually they will then provide services for you. But if you do that, you will end up with the same situation again. You need to trust within to the intermediary. And therefore, we said, okay, we will have a bunch of new intermediaries. I will not go into that detail. What I will give you now is 3 takeaways. One is the token container model, which is the flexible approach where you can actually let the token represent whatever right you have. You have the coordination requirement. So even if it is not by law that if you transfer the token, the represented right is transferred, there is the obligation that you have sufficient measurement that this is actually the result you will get. And finally, you have the physical validator. As I said, that's one of the intermediaries. You have to bear in mind that if you want to bridge the real world with the digital world, we didn't touch too much into that. Because I have only some minutes left, what I will just give you as an overview, I think you will have some specific talks about that. What I think is really huge with the marketing crypto assets regulation, the draft of that, is that it's a EU-wide crypto assets regulation for sure, but the pilot regime for market infrastructures on DLT is as interesting as the MiCA itself. I think you already have the information there. But some days ago, not only Professor Sandner was in Liechtenstein, it was on the 22nd of October, but also Dr. Joachim Schwerin from the European Commission. And he held a speech about the digital finance package, as I referred to with MiCA and the DLT pilot regime. And one of his slides was actually this slide you see here. And I mean, if you look at the headline, he actually said that they switched the light to green for the token economy. So it's not only about regulating parts of it. The idea in the long run is actually to have the same concept of a token economy on a European scale, which I think is actually very, very interesting. And I will not touch into detail there because I'm running out of time. But what I want to end my talk with is that if you analyze the scope of MiCA in comparison to the Blockchain Act, yes, some of the intermediaries we have in our act will actually be outdated. Will not, because MiCA is a regulation. So if Liechtenstein or the European Economic Area will adopt this legislation as well, it will actually rule over some of our intermediaries. But the interesting part here is that you have already some intermediaries which are quite the same as you have it in MiCA. And if you look at some articles specifically about the transition period, it's very interesting that if MiCA comes in the way it is drafted at the moment, if you have a local regulation which has which have a similar level like MiCA, it allows for a simplified procedure for applications. So if you want to start your business now, you can do that actually based on the Blockchain Act, and hopefully, because if you look at the level of regulation, it seems similar. It will be easier to actually then adopt your registration under the Blockchain Act to a license under MiCA, and then you will get access, hopefully, again to the European market. That was it from my part. I think we will have afterwards also a panel. I'm really looking forward to that panel, and thank you very much.